So I have no slides. I had no idea that I was going to have such a beautiful display behind me, and so I have no slides. So now I feel small. So to help me feel a bit bigger, I'm just going to get everybody to just stand up and just shake yourself out a little bit, right? Because that will give me the equivalent of having really amazing. Like imagine there's a beach or a star, like your favorite screensaver is just running by. Okay, good. Okay, good. I feel like You've done your bit now. Okay, so this, as you can probably tell, is going to be a little bit more freewheeling. I don't have science on my side. I don't have data. I do have anecdotes, and the multiple of anecdotes is a history. So I will try and provide some historical context, particularly in the area that I work with. I work with the Filecoin Foundation. We're just down there. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time with working with this wider community is how to preserve digital public goods, or more importantly, the digital commons. The Filecoin ecosystem is really designed about preserving humanity's most important knowledge. That's kind of what the technology is aimed to do. But we realized very soon after sort of building out this technology that there are a lot of other aspects to that. I don't know whether I was asking not ChatGPT, because I'm a bit fancy. I was asking Claude, like, whether knowledge itself was a public good, and I think it falls into that category of, is language a public good? Is the very idea of money and markets a public good? But it's definitely something that feels like a commons, right? It feels like a common pool, a common resource that we draw from. And the firmament, I think, that digital public goods, digital commons generally come from, and in many ways the sort of existence proof that we can nurture and create these things is of course, the internet. And for me, what I find really interesting about the internet in this particular stage is it's sort of the length of a lifetime at this point. I think everybody, particularly in the current political situation, is sort of aware that the things that happened 70 or 80 years ago, or even 100 years ago, pass out of immediate human knowledge. And so they sort of ossify into a set of rules that we don't know whether we can bend or break, or whether that they are necessary, sufficient, or both for our continuing culture, right? But things that are in that sort of 50-year period are things where we still have the people around who existed before that thing happened, before that institution, before that culture emerged. And we have, perhaps lucky enough, to have the people who were involved in that moment. I am not one of those people. I think I was born maybe a few days before the first nodes of the internet were emerged in sort of July 1969. But we now collectively have this implicit knowledge of how that system evolved, either because we were involved in it or we had to bear the opportunities and the ramifications of how that evolved. The internet, the design of the internet is a pervasive feature of our world that was not even conceptualized in the lifetimes of our, or the growing up periods of our great-grandparents before human living knowledge exists. So we have an example here which I think is really useful if we're thinking about public goods and commons in general, right? Which is the emergence of a commons within that lifetime. And I think we can think about how rare that is. I think when we think, I've been to Bangkok several times over the last 20 or 30 years. Last time I was here is actually at the beginning of the internet's relationship with the Thai economy and political system. And of course, it's fascinating to be in an emerging city like Bangkok and to watch what I think is a general understanding of progress, which is often, and I don't mean this in a sort of negative way, but it's often about enclosure and control, rationalization, increasing legibility, right? It's not about creating a new commons as taking existing resources and making them more practical and useful either for individuals or for the state or for the collective world, right? So what we have on something like the internet is the emergence of a new shared resource. As I was thinking through like sort of how I would structure this, I realized that so many of the language of exploring and generating those sort of commons has this somewhat colonialist tang to it, right? Sort of homesteading, exploration, colonization, literally, right? But what we can, if we want to step away from that, is this idea of exploring a new fallow land, which isn't owned or legible or mapped in any way up until this point, right? The unexplored, I'm not going to say unexplored country, because that either means death or a Star Trek film. But the unexplored territory of the internet. So this is the first moment, right? This is the moment of a new commons emerging. And let me just walk through a couple of things that are sort of interesting and perhaps missed now in that moment of the internet emerging. So let's skip past kind of the mythology, right, of a military internet that was based around decentralization, that was initially non-commercial and academic, and then quickly private institutions were allowed to join it. Let's even sort of miss out that first layer of the propagation of the hardware and the protocol, where the internet was able to compete with centralized proprietary systems. And I think we forget that, you know, big actors like Microsoft, run by Bill Gates at that point, Rupert Murdoch even, were building proprietary networks, and so were states, right? So France, for instance, had Minitel. The United Kingdom had a similar semi-public-private network called Prestel, and similar national networks were being experimented at emerging. And the reason why the internet ended up being a global network was the very simple factor that people were able to, once they understood the open source protocol, as the previous speaker talked about, were able to just connect to it, that it could grow around the edges. Is that a commons? It's a commons of sorts, right? It's definitely creating a fallow area. If you imagine the classic example of the commons, which is sort of, in my mind at least, a sort of flat grass field where cows are potentially, or your favorite kind of agricultural animal, are kind of eating grass, and perhaps they're eating too much grass, right? But there's this idea of like the floodplain emerges. So we have this hardware expanding, right? But this is 10 minutes, excellent. This is a place to create a digital public commons, and I think where people think about it now, they mostly think about it in terms of the web, right? So now we have this space, so we're in this secondary stage where the opportunity for a commons, an unenclosed space emerges, and now we fill it. I think there's a couple of interesting things that I want to, this is the nugget of what I want to talk about, and then we can talk about the sad things later. But how did that commons fill, right? How did we get the features like, just to pluck some examples, sort of Wikipedia, right? A fairly late entrance into that commons. The idea of web pages themselves, right? People contributing these things. And I think there are a couple of things, right? One was the one that we're very sort of understanding about, that like the more that you put in, the more that you can take out, right? Like one of the things that drove this groundwork, right, of say and I will age myself here beautifully here, but things like the blogging revolution and things like this. People contributing to a commons for free was the sense that, oh, I'm adding to this collective venture. But there's another period prior to this which is interesting. So who here has ever used the Internet Movie Database, IMDb? Okay, great. So the Internet Movie Database is probably, if you do a search and you've got your favorite star, right, that's the bit that will tell you information about it. So the Internet Movie Database actually emerged before its current owner, Amazon. So it used to be called the Cardiff University Movie Database, and it was run by students. Where did they get the information from? They got it by people contributing. Why did they do that? Because at that point, the music and the movie industries, the entertainment industry, deliberately or not, was withdrawing its labor from the internet, from the web, because there was no monetary aspect to it, right? Like if you think again, if any of you can cast your minds back to maybe being a kid and using Encarta, which was a Microsoft encyclopedia, right, that was on one of those silver dishes. Encarta was a proprietary thing like the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was the presumption of what digital information was going to be like, right, owned in that way. Now, people, the commercial side did not contribute to the web because there was no obvious monetary incentive, right? But that creates a vacuum, right? That sucks in information, right? That pulls in these resources because people saw this capability and wanted to fill it out. Now, I don't know if there had been that kind of, if there had been a sort of legitimate competition between a pricing system and this voluntary effort, whether the voluntary effort would have filled that space available. I think it's interesting that those national networks that I described about, even though they were state-run, assumed that they had to build a monetary system on top of them. Prestel charged money for individual pages. Lots of companies worked on Minitel and had a payment system. But what you created is a resource. So now we talk about having created an opportunity for a commons to exist, to do almost the opposite of an enclosure, to create some sort of barrier around it so that it could not be enclosed, right? Then you have the potentially the threat, right? Like if we want to preserve commons, I think one of the biggest challenges is under-resourcing it, under-supplying support for it. There is always the risk of over-exhausting it, right? And I think you can think of that as like just people kind of, I don't like misinformation and disinformation as terms, but you can imagine like filling up space, the idea of spam. But you also have always the threat of enclosure, right? So, and I think for a more recent generation of people experiencing the internet, what they experience is this sense of enclosure, right? That the data and the information, the same way as the IMDb went from being a public resource to being a privately owned resource, still available, right? Like the private provision of public resources is still there, but the incentives around that kind of differ. So what does it mean to protect a resource like that? Well, I don't want to go all Eleanor Ostrom on you, because I think you probably all know these great works, and anyway, I have about 2 minutes. But one of the things that I think you will find in this community, if you are not part of this existing community, if you've come more from the traditional funding environment, is an attempt to try and create those ways of pushing out and creating a self-sustaining regenerative commons. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it because, and this is sort of my end here, I think a lot of the ways that we're going to frame and think about the commons, 1 minute, good, nailing it, is that this is a thing that requires resourcing, that requires money, that requires funding, right? And I think one of the risks of that, as funders, as donors, as supporters, as it were, is that rather than keeping this space as an area to sort of endlessly explore and create, right, you end up essentially making it as legible and quantifiable as the city we see emerging around us, right? That by paying for certain things, right? So you say, okay, Wikipedia needs to survive, therefore, and I know Wikipedia because it's legible, right? I'm going to direct all my money to Wikipedia, right? Then we create something that is in itself just an artifact, right? When Wikipedia started, the presumption was we would have 1 million Wikipedias, right? 1 million things like that. And as we got regularity and legibility, we end up with one Wikipedia. So my last thought to you is, okay, this is the life cycle of the commons. It's very natural for it to have texture and for have institutions that like we just sit there and go, well, Wikipedia or Mozilla or even the internet itself, it's been around all my life and therefore it will exist forever. The really interesting moment is creating those new commons, right? As exploring and pushing those things out. And that's, I think, if you want a sort of guide to understanding this community that I love, Filecoin Foundation funds funding the commons, we participate and use many of the tools that are built. That's how I think about it. It's not about how do we really fund the commons, it's how we grow and expand and create new ones. So thank you very much.
All right.